This is Value Investing. I'm your host, Jun Kim. In this podcast, you'll learn everything related to value investing. Hello, fellow investors. Welcome to another episode of Value Investing. On today's show, I'm going to talk about why Korean stock market is undervalued relative to US stock market. And I'm originally from Korea, and I feel that I know a lot about Korean stock market. And I also noticed that a lot of people in the US do not know a lot of emerging markets. So I feel that this is great opportunity for those of you who know other emerging markets to invest their money. Because right now, if you look at the US market, a lot of stocks are very overvalued, because the whole market has been overvalued for quite some time. And I think that the market can actually rally for a while, and also nobody exactly knows when we're going to have another correction in the future. But in this kind of overvalued environment, it's also wise to look at other areas and outside of the United States where you can find more undervalued opportunities. So that's what I have been trying to do. And since I'm originally from Korea, I looked at a lot of different Korean stocks, and I noticed that they are quite undervalued relative to US counterparts. And I also considered like quality of the company and all different valuation multiples. And that's the conclusion that I derived. And a lot of analysts and a lot of economists agree with the point that Korean stock market is undervalued compared to other developed markets. So on today's show, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about why Korean stock market is undervalued, and I'm going to lay out some reasons for the undervaluation. So before I get started, let me just give you a quick disclaimer that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and it is your responsibility to consult with your investment professional for any investment decisions. So without further ado, why don't we get started? So I'm going to talk about why Korean stock market is undervalued, and I posted one article on my website, shareinvestmentideas.com, on this matter. So I'm going to just try to go over 7 different reasons why I think that Korean stock market is undervalued. Before we actually do that, let me just give you the reason why it is important for you to know the reason behind undervaluation. Because it's likely that you're either US investor, Canadian investor, or UK investor, because those are the people listening to this podcast most. I did some statistics, and seems like there are a lot of people listening to my podcast from English-speaking countries. So you guys are very familiar with your market. However, if you really want to venture out, find out really good value opportunities, emerging markets are very good places. I don't think that it's fair to categorize Korean stock market as emerging market, but it still has, I would say that it's right in between emerging market versus developed market. Even though GDP per capita is high, the Korean market is relatively small. So that's why I would say that it's right in between emerging market and developed market. But anyway, so that's why it's important for you to venture out and try to find out undervalued opportunities outside of United States. But you also want to stay within your circle of confidence. That's the most important concept for as a value investor. But if you can actually expand your circle of confidence in other countries' stocks, then you probably will be able to increase your chance of being successful as an investor. Anyway, that's the reason behind why I think it is important for you to understand other foreign markets. So let me give you the reasons why Korean stock market is undervalued. Number 1, relatively low shareholder-friendly policies. I think that this is first reason why Korean stock market is undervalued. So all things considered, Korean companies are less friendly towards their investors than the US counterparts. In general, Korean companies pay lower dividend yields and carry out less share purchases. And a lot of people here in the US also are criticizing companies to give out the money to their shareholders. For example, if you look at a political spectrum, what a lot of people are saying is that companies should not purchase their shares. And that was one of the things that a lot of people talked about when it comes to tax benefit that Donald Trump administration gave out to its corporations. And people are criticizing that why we give tax break for these corporations because they're going to just use this money and benefit to purchase their shares. But I disagree because I don't want to get into the politics, but what I like to say is that the corporations should give the money back to investors if they cannot find good usage of that money. Because they can just put the money on their balance sheet, but it's not going to yield much, as you can see from low interest rate environment. So what they can do is give out this money back to shareholders. Okay, so I got sidetracked a little bit here, but what I want to emphasize is that Korean companies used to hold back on giving out money to shareholders, whether in the form of dividends or share repurchases. But now there are some companies trying to go towards more shareholder-friendly policies, but still there's a long way to go for a lot of these companies. So I think that's the first reason why I believe the Korean stock market is undervalued. Because if these companies implement shareholder-friendly policies, then these companies should be able to attract a lot of foreign investors that's going to be able to bring up the stock price for a lot of these companies. The second reason that I want to mention here is immature investing culture. I didn't really want to use this word immature, but I think that's what's happening right now in this stock market. Many Korean people tend to consider the stock market to be a casino, and they stay away from the market altogether. That's what happens for most people. Additionally, there are not many value investors, and many people trade stocks too frequently without the consideration of fundamentals. So this phenomena often creates big discrepancies between intrinsic value and market value for many companies. So I personally think that the more discrepancies, the better for value investors like me. You can think of the US stock market when Warren Buffett first started his investment partnership. It was 1954, and a lot of people didn't really know how to do value investing. Benjamin Graham came up with this value investing concept and was trying to spread out this knowledge to many people. But back then, the stock market was quite inefficient, and there were a lot of value investing opportunities because of that. So I believe that's potentially the case for the Korean stock market right now. And a lot of people just don't know how to do the value investing, and a lot of people just think of stock market as casino and they just stay away from that. I think that's a big mistake. But as a value investors, I feel that I can take advantage of this opportunity and invest my money there. Okay, let's move on to the third reason. The third reason is because of concerns about the power abuse by controlling shareholders. So this is a big problem in many of big Korean companies. 재벌 is a term used to describe a large industrial conglomerate that is run and controlled by an owner or family in South Korea. Samsung is a good example. In the past, these 재벌s have implemented ethically questionable business practices that enriched themselves at the expense of other small investors. Lee Jae-yong, the only son of Samsung chairman, was accused of bribery, embezzlement, and perjury by the South Korean prosecutor's office and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. In many cases, 재벌s create their own private companies and boost up their private companies' valuation by abusing their control power in the public companies in a way that they can make their private companies a monopoly supplier for that public company. So that was a good example of how a lot of these controlling shareholders, not a lot, I shouldn't probably say a lot, but there are a certain number of controlling shareholders abusing their power because they have such a high status in that public company. And a lot of small investors suffer as a result. So that was one big negative that I noticed from a lot of these large conglomerates in South Korea. Let's move on to the next reason. The next reason why I think that Korean stock market is undervalued is because of dependence on exports to China and the US. South Korean economy is dependent in large part on the exports to China and the US. So as a result, if something blows up in China or the US, South Korean stocks would suffer immediately. So this is the problem that South Korean economy has right now, because South Korean economy is not relatively big compared to China or the US, and it suffers quite a bit if something goes wrong with its exports. So in large part, South Korea makes tons of money from exports, and for whatever reason, if it cannot export products and goods, then the economy is going to suffer quite a bit. Whereas if you look at the US, a lot of GDP is coming from consumer spending. And that's actually quite healthy in many aspects, in my view. But that's not necessarily the case for small countries like South Korea. Let's move on to the next reason. The next reason is because of geopolitical risk. So I think a lot of you guys already know that Korea is divided into two Koreas, North and South. And South Korea has been always on alert in regard to a potential war against North Korea. In the face of the nuclear program advancement by North Korea, if there's a full-blown war between the two countries, the wealth of South Korean investors could be wiped out. So that's a very scary scenario for investors. I think that the probability of war between South Korea and North Korea is quite slim, almost to zero. But there's always this unexpected probability that could play out in the future, and I think that's what a lot of foreign investors are concerned about. Because if you look at CNN or all these Fox News, what you see from North Korea is that they are developing nuclear weapons, and they are always very aggressive in terms of using the language that are usually not appropriate in certain situations, and they are always trying to threaten South Korean people and the US allies and so on. So that's why I think whenever that kind of things happen, South Korean market suffers, at least in a short period of time. And also, speaking of geopolitical risk, it is also possible that North Korea regime collapses all of a sudden, and unification takes place between two Koreas. So if you look at Germany's, right, in light of the reunification of two Germany's, South Korea is expected to bear a huge economic cost, at least in the short term, given the current economic gap between two Koreas. So think about it. Right now, if you look at South Korea, it's almost developed country and rich country. But if you look at North Korea, a lot of people there are starving to death, and there's a huge economic gap between these two Koreas. So if there's reunification happens all of a sudden in an unexpected manner, then South Korean economy is going to take a hit largely. And in the long term, South Korean economy is going to boom and will actually benefit quite a lot from reunification. But at least in the short term, we're going to suffer quite a bit in terms of helping out North Korean people and make them successful in the long term. So those are the two geopolitical risks that I can think of from the South Korean economy perspective. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is the currency risk. And this currency risk exists in any emerging markets, right? But this is a huge one that US investors should think about, because if you look at Argentina and Turkey, they are the countries that suffer quite a bit from this exchange rate volatility in recent years. Because if you look at their political environment, it's quite volatile, and they are suffering quite a lot from economic turmoil there. And who knows? You never know what's going to happen to other countries. US is relatively very stable and strong country, so US could suffer from recession and depression and things like that, but it's going to come out strong always because it has strong fundamental and foundation on its economy. But that's not necessarily the case for a lot of emerging countries and a lot of small countries like South Korea, and that's always the risk that you have to bear and think about. Lastly, I want to also mention population decline, and that's almost 100% certainty. And if you look at Japanese stock long time ago, 20 years ago, Japanese stock had increased quite a bit because of economic development and technology advancement at that time. But Japanese stock market has suffered quite a bit over the last 20 years. And if you look at US stock market has been always on the rise. There were a lot of blips along the way, and there were a lot of crashes along the way. But if you look at long-term trend, it has been always on the rise. But that's not necessarily the case for Japanese stock market. And that could well happen to South Korean stock market as well. Because what happened in Japan is the number of people living there, the population declined quite a bit, and a lot of young people had to support old people. And if you don't have the right mix between different generations, the economy cannot really advance in the future. And right now, that's what's happening in Korea. A lot of couples do not have kids, and on average, couples have only one kid or less than one kid. And that's kind of the reality that a lot of South Korean people are facing. And we are trying to change our culture and laws so that we allow more immigrants come to our country and make it more vibrant economy. But there's always the resistance within the culture to make that happen. So I think that's kind of the biggest risk that Korean people are facing right now. And personally, I think we have to open up our borders and so on in order to make the economy move and also have more young people in the country. But that's not going to probably happen anytime soon because of political reasons. So those are the reasons why I think that there are many companies being undervalued as of right now. And I personally invested some money there because I couldn't really find good opportunities in the US. And it's something you might consider. But also one disadvantage that you're going to have as an individual and US investor is the fact that you're not going to get a lot of good information with respect to Korean companies. Because all this public information is written in Korean. You don't probably know how to read Korean, and you probably don't even know where to find good information regarding Korean companies. So that's a huge knowledge gap, and I completely aware of that. So I just try to use that maybe to my advantage because I know there are a lot of good investors in the US and good value investors, and if the information is easily available, then market is going to be very efficient, and the Korean stock market would not have been undervalued. Actually, that's a good reason also that I didn't mention. But since information is not available and easily accessible to foreign investors, that's why I think also Korean stock market is undervalued. But what I'm going to do is, as I mentioned in my previous episodes, I can talk about individual Korean stocks, and I can also upload my stock ideas on my website, shareinvestmentideas.com, and try to talk about undervalued opportunities there. And I also heard from people that there are a lot of undervalued opportunities in Japanese stock market, because Japanese stock market is also very unique, and in many cases you can also find net stocks. And if you don't know what that means, you can also just Google. So it's basically the methodology that Ben Graham used before in order to find out undervalued stocks. And you usually don't find those kind of net stocks in the US because it's already overvalued, and I don't think that you'll find those stocks in the future. I can't say never, but usually those kind of stocks are not available anymore. Okay, so today we talked about why Korean stock market is undervalued. I hope that you'll learn something from this episode. And I don't want to really apply this concept only to Korean market, because if you look at other emerging markets, right? And if you look at other developed countries, there are, I think, more opportunities there. And if you can find good information, then you should be able to get ahead of other people, because I just feel that there are so much competition in the US stock market, and it's just not easy to find good undervalued opportunities. And over the last 10 years since financial crisis, value investors have not performed well as compared to growth investors. And also it has been very challenging to beat S&P 500, and that's kind of the fact that exists in the US stock market. I think in the future the trend might change, and I think people will actually perform differently. But if you cannot find good opportunities, just think that it's nice to look outside and just look at different options. But as I mentioned in the intro, you just have to stay within your circle of confidence. That's what matters most. But if you know how to expand your circle of confidence, then feel free to do so. And other foreign markets might be a good place to start. Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed this show. That's all I have. And as I mentioned, I'm going to upload my articles to my website, shareinvestmentideas.com, and you can just sign up for free. And once you sign up, you're going to get 2,000 points, which you can use to read up to 5 articles. And you don't have to pay. What you have to do to earn point is just upload your article, and you're going to get certain number of points from the contribution. And that's the idea about this website. And whenever I have some free time, I'll try to make contribution to the website, and I'm the owner of the website, so I'll just do my best to get connect with my listeners and also create some community here so that we can get to know each other. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.